Good day, everyone. On behalf of Harvard Law School, the Veterans Legal Clinic of the WilmerHale Legal Services Center, the Law School's Armed Forces Association, and Disabled American Veterans, welcome to the 2020 DAV Distinguished Speaker Series. We have an outstanding group of panelists for what promises to be an extremely thought-provoking conversation today on race, the military, and veterans. I'm Daniel Nagin, Faculty Director of the Veterans Legal Clinic and the Legal Services Center. We are very pleased to have an audience joining us online today from across the country. Let me first offer a few notes about our closed captioning option today. Closed captioning is available during today's discussion. To enable this, click Closed Caption on the bar at the bottom of the webinar window. To change the size of the captions, click the small up arrow directly next to Closed Caption and select Subtitle Settings. A new window will open where you can move the slider to increase or decrease the size of the captions on the screen. If you have any technological issues or concerns during today's discussion, please let us know via the Zoom chat. Later, you can submit questions for our panelists during the presentation. We have reserved time for Q&A with our audience later in the session. In addition, please note that everyone also has the option of clicking on the top left corner of your Zoom screen to allow you to switch to gallery view. That will be helpful potentially later in the session so that you can see all the panelists when they are in conversation with each other. I'm eager to turn the proceedings over to our moderator and terrific panelists. But before I do, I'd like to share a few introductory words. First, I want to extend our deep gratitude to DAV for its sponsorship of this speaker series and for its incredible support of and partnership with the Veterans Legal Clinic in so many ways. DAV, with its 1 million strong membership, is an inspiring example of veteran community building and empowerment. We could not be more honored to collaborate with DAV. Today's event marks the 7th annual DAV speaker series at Harvard Law School. The goal of the series is to bring together important leaders and advocates from the veterans community to shine a spotlight on the unmet needs of veterans and disabled veterans and create a platform for both conversation and action. The theme of today's discussion and the esteemed panelists who have come together represent another important moment in the series' history. I also want to acknowledge the Harvard Law School Student Armed Forces Association for its co-sponsorship. We are also pleased that so many members of the Armed Forces Association have participated as student attorneys in the Veterans Legal Clinic. For those who don't know, the Veterans Legal Clinic is part of the Legal Services Center of Harvard Law School. In addition to the Veterans Legal Clinic, the center is home to 5 other civil practice clinics, addressing consumer law, including litigation to combat predatory for-profit colleges, housing law, family law, domestic violence, tax law, and LGBTQ+ rights. The center is a major part of the law school's clinical program and leverages its community-based location in the city of Boston to reach thousands of low-income clients every year and provide community members with essential legal services. The Veterans Legal Clinic focuses its work on advocating for low-income disabled veterans and their family members in a range of veterans and military law matters. The clinic represents veterans of all generations and combines individual client advocacy with initiatives that seek to reform the system that serve the veterans community. The clinic's practice areas span everything from estate planning and Social Security appeals to discharge upgrades before Department of Defense tribunals and practice before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims and policy advocacy at the state and federal levels. Among many priority areas, we often advocate for veterans who unjustly received less than honorable discharges. In many of these cases, unrecognized mental health conditions from combat trauma or military sexual trauma can lead to life-altering challenges both in service and after discharge. And most relevant to our discussion topic today, some cases involve minority veterans who experienced discrimination in service and were wrongfully disciplined and discharged. To learn more about our work and about the center, we invite you to visit our website, legalservicescenter.org. I am now very honored to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Will Gunn. We are thrilled that Mr. Gunn has returned, even if virtually, to his law school alma mater to moderate our panel. He has had an extraordinary and distinguished career committed to public service and leadership. Mr. Gunn is a 1986 cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, having previously graduated with military honors from the Air Force Academy. Over the course of a 2-decade-plus career in the Air Force, Mr. Gunn rose to the rank of colonel. His accomplishments during his career in the Air Force JAG Corps are too numerous to mention now, but I will note that his service included being named the first ever Chief Defense Counsel in the Department of Defense Office of Military Commissions in connection with the representation of prisoners held at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. Mr. Gunn continued his commitment to public service after retiring from the Air Force. Among many distinguished leadership roles, he served for 5 years as General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. For more information about Mr. Gunn's countless other activities and leadership roles, I invite you to view his full biography on our event page on the Legal Services Center website. I could not imagine a more impressive or thoughtful person to moderate today's important discussion. I am very pleased to now hand over the proceedings to Mr. Gunn.
Thanks, Dan. Greetings, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I was eager to accept when Dan invited me to moderate this panel because our topic is at the intersection of some major roads in my life. First, I'm a Black man. I served in the military for 25 years on active duty and 4 years at the Air Force Academy before that. I've also served in a key role in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Also, Harvard Law School has played a pivotal role in my life. 40 years ago, when I graduated from the Air Force Academy, it was just a year after that I visited Harvard Square and Harvard's campus for the very first time. Immediately, I knew that's where I wanted to be. I started law school just a couple of years later, and as a law student, I fulfilled my third-year paper writing requirement under the direction of the late Judge A. Leon Higginbotham, and focused on the topic of racial policies in the U.S. military since 1940. I've been interested in the topic and have studied Black military history ever since. Time doesn't permit us to do a deep dive into Black American military history today, but I believe it will be helpful to provide some context. You see, from the time that the first Black people came to Jamestown, Virginia as slaves 401 years ago in 1619, Black people have contributed to the military strength of what is now the United States of America. A unique aspect of that history is that during slavery, Black people served in the U.S. military and in some instances fought against the U.S. military in an attempt to gain their freedom. Another central theme of this history is that when America was short on manpower, the nation welcomed Blacks into the military. But when the immediate need for military personnel abated, Black people were rejected. You see, Black people weren't segregated in the earliest editions of the nation's military. However, segregation became the norm, beginning with Black soldiers who served during the Civil War. And segregation prevailed, at least in some part, until 1952, when the Army finally inactivated its last all-Black unit, 4 years after President Truman signed an executive order, which was designed to end segregation in the armed forces. Black Americans were present among the forces fighting in the French and Indian War and every war since the American Revolution. For example, in 1770, 250 years ago, a Black man named Crispus Attucks was among the first to die in the Boston Massacre. And another Black man named Peter Salem is credited with killing a British assault force commander during the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. During the Civil Rights era, the military was described by many people as the most integrated institution in American life. And it has also been described as a microcosm of America, with everything that that term entails. Great progress has been made over the last few decades, and some have looked to the military and as an exemplar of equality and merit principles. Indeed, in 1989, General Colin Powell became the military's highest ranking officer when he was named chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In 2014, Admiral Michelle Howard, a 1982 Naval Academy graduate and a Black woman, became the Navy's first female four-star admiral. And in September of this year, General Charles C.Q. Brown became Air Force Chief of Staff, and in doing so, became the first Black service chief of any military service. However, those first don't tell the whole story. For example, I spent many years of my military career prosecuting and then even more time defending cases. And the data shows gross disparities with respect to race in the military justice system. For example, on average, Black Marines are 32% more likely to be found guilty at a court-martial or non-judicial punishment proceeding than are white Marines. In the Navy, Black sailors are on average 40% more likely to be found guilty at a court-martial or non-judicial punishment proceeding than are white sailors. In the Army, Black soldiers are on average 61% more likely to face a special or general court-martial than are white soldiers. Finally, in the Air Force, where I spent my career, Black airmen are on average 71% more likely to face court-martial or non-judicial punishment proceedings than are white airmen. And it's important to keep in mind, we're not talking about an era in which people can just walk in to a recruiter and join the military. No, they have to face and they have to meet rigorous entry requirements. Similar disparities also exist with respect to officer promotions. As for veterans, the GI Bill that was passed at the end of World War II gave veterans education benefits and home loan guarantees that Black veterans, particularly those in the South, but not just those in the South, weren't able to take advantage of at the same rate as whites. On the education front, Blacks were excluded from many colleges, and even though the US government was guaranteeing home loans, many Black veterans were unable to use their GI Bill benefits to buy homes because banks were unwilling to give them mortgages. Thus, they were denied home ownership, the foundation of generational wealth that millions of their white counterparts received as a result of the GI Bill. Today, data shows that Black veterans suffer from health disparities and are overly represented among the homeless population. Despite the setbacks and the disparities, there is reason for some optimism. First, many senior military leaders realize that diversity is absolutely essential to military readiness. Also, several African Americans have ascended to the top ranks of both the officer and enlisted ranks of the services. In fact, with the exception of the Marines and the Coast Guard, all of the military services have had multiple Black officers achieve the highest possible rank of 4-star, full general, or full admiral. Finally, President-elect Biden has indicated that he wants to make diversity and inclusion a major feature of his administration. Our nation is in need of racial healing. And there's much more to the story. But in order to help tell that story, I'd like to turn to our distinguished panelists. I will introduce them one at a time, and after each introduction, they will each give brief remarks. When the introductions and remarks are all done, we'll follow up with a few questions from me, and then you can ask your own questions as time permits. Our first panelist is Ms. Delphine Metcalf-Foster. Ms. Foster is a disabled Army veteran. In 2017, she was elected National Commander of the Disabled American Veterans, the DAV, one of the nation's largest veteran services organizations with more than 1 million members. She was the first female to hold the position in the DAV's nearly 100-year history. She's a native of Vallejo, California, and was injured in January of 1991 while serving in Saudi Arabia in support of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. After her injuries, she was medically evacuated to Germany for care and treatment. Ms. Foster is a life member of DAV and is a former member of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Advisory Committee on Women Veterans. She's a graduate of Sonoma State University, where she majored in psychology and liberal studies. She's a retired quality assurance work leader from the Alameda Naval Air Station in Alameda, California. Interestingly enough, she has the rare distinction in 2020 of being the daughter of a veteran of the Spanish-American War. Ms. Foster, the floor is yours for brief remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I am so grateful for this opportunity on this open dialogue for our veterans. First of all, I'd like to tell you about my family in the military. I'm a daughter, as the colonel said, of a U.S. Army Buffalo soldier in the Spanish-American War. I'm a mother of a U.S. Navy veteran son who's deceased. I'm a grandmother of a U.S. Army granddaughter, Iraq, Afghanistan veterans. I always felt I was empowered as a woman veteran because of my parents and their strong, steadfast path that they made for me after coming from Alabama to California. As you can see in the article, my father sued the state and county of Vallejo to let colored troops into the Veterans Building that which I attend was my first meeting with the Disabled American Veterans. Being an active member in the Disabled American Veterans and an advocate for women, we continue to work for legislation changes for all concerns. Our folks in Washington are staying on top of the critical issues and ensuring women themselves have a seat at the table. And that was one of the reasons that I went into the military, plus my family history. I was working at Lebanon Army Medical Center and a statement was made by a major, and I won't call her name because I respect her very dearly. Her name was Major White. And at the time I was in the medical field. And she asked me to come to her office. And I went down to her office and I saw all these pamphlets that said United States Army. And she looked at me and she says, Delphine, I would like to know, had you ever thought about going into the military? And I stated, yes, I did. I said, when my father was alive, I was 5 years old when he passed away. But he was so proud of the pictures he would show me, the black and white pictures on the horse. And since I couldn't ride a horse, you know, that dream went out the window, I thought, until I met Major White. And she said, well, you know, I think you would be a good leader in the military. And I looked at her and she said, I know your history. You're married, you have a family, but I noticed you in the union meetings. You treat everybody the same. It doesn't matter about rank. You respect rank, but you treat everyone the same. And you know, there's a myth about women in the military. and my antennas went up. Here I am, a product of the 60s and 70s, women. And she said, yes. She said, most women, they have this stereotype. They go in there to find a husband. They're going to find a job, to get away from home. But I see you bringing something to them and breaking some of that myth. Well, that's all she needed to say. After I went home and convinced my husband, by the way, who was in the Navy at the time, that I would like to go in, the rest is history. I started like everyone else, basic training. I went in with my daughter, who was a senior in high school at the time, and she lasted 2 weeks and I lasted 21 years. And I started going to my Army Reserve. I was in the Army Reserve, and I had so many mentors that told me the same thing. And it gave me this feeling of my dad. What would he have thought? What would he had to deal with? How would he think about this? How would all my relatives that came from Alabama, that's still in Alabama, I just started looking at history. I started feeling, hey, this is a responsibility. So I went in, I had a great tour. I got called up, the colonel said, in 1990 for the Gulf War. I took my company, which was a grave registration company, over to Saudi Arabia. After being injured, coming back to the States after 2 months, I stayed in a medical hold at Letterman Army Medical Center for a month until my general asked me, what did I want to do? And stated I could get out of the military on a medical discharge. I stated, no, I will not be discharged. I want to go back and get my troops. We never leave our troops behind. They are our battle buddies. So with medication and what have you, I went back to Saudi Arabia, retrieved my troops after 3 months, and came back to Presidio, San Francisco. I stayed on medical hold for a year. After that time, I was discharged and I got involved with a great organization, the Disabled American Veterans. My company and I were greeted by the DAV, Transitional Service Officer, when we returned to the States. He told us all about our benefits. He told us about what we need to do in order for education. He gave us the whole gamut. That is why I joined the Disabled American Veterans. I've been a member of the Disabled American Veterans for 31 years, and I cannot find a better organization that is dedicated to a single purpose of empowering its veterans to lead a high quality and respectful life with respect and dignity. I've had issues with mental health, but I started getting involved with our local VA facilities for PTSD. But one thing I was very floored about in 2005, I was invited to a veteran center to speak to some veterans. And I noticed all the veterans there were Black, which was fine. I had a great time. But afterwards, I asked the provider, I says, wow, I've never been to an all veterans counseling group. She says, well, welcome. She said, they have had to have this because our veterans felt like the mental health with the VA was not what they needed. They did not listen to their concerns. And I was floored. I said, what do you mean? She says, no, they did not listen to their concerns. And so that's why they have to come to the vet center. So she passed away about 5 years later, and I never heard about any veterans group again until this year, 2020. I get a flyer from my local VA. Please join our Black veterans group. And I'm thinking, wow, nothing has changed. So I joined the group myself to see, because I'm an advocate of being part of, to learn myself. Only to find out that the issues that our Black veterans were having, they were not addressed at our local VA facilities. Their culture, how they felt about life, and what have you. And it's just appalling to me that from my dad's beginning in the military to 2020, things still have not been ironed out. That's why I'm so glad, as I stated before, to be a part of this dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Foster. Greatly appreciate it. Our next speaker today is Professor Christopher Parker. Professor Christopher Sebastian Parker is a Navy veteran who serves as a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. The bulk of his research takes a behavioral approach to historical events. More specifically, he brings survey data to bear on questions of historical importance. His first book, Fighting for Democracy: Black Veterans and the Struggle Against White Supremacy in the Post-War South, was published by Princeton University Press in 2009. The book won the American Political Science Association's Ralph J. Bunche Award. It takes a fresh approach to the civil rights movement by evaluating the extent to which Black veterans contributed to social change. His second book, Change They Can't Believe in: The Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America, was published in 2013, and it explores the beliefs, attitudes, and behavior of the Tea Party. This book won the American Political Science Association's award for the best book in race, ethnicity, and politics. Professor Parker did his undergrad work at UCLA and holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. Professor Parker, your microphone is open for brief remarks.
Thank you, Colonel Gunn, and I am delighted to be part of this august panel. My remarks will be brief. I'm looking at this picture of mine. Boy, this picture's like 20 years old, and I'm just like, oh wow, I should have uploaded a more recent picture. But anyway, I digress. So let me just cut right to the matter, cut right to the heart of it. Basically, this country wouldn't be where it is right now as a democracy such as it were. I mean, it's kind of funny, and I don't mean funny in a ha-ha way, but I mean funny in a peculiar way to be discussing American democracy now, because we're teetering on the edge of something else at the moment. But what I want to say is that Black folks, have been pulling, America's fat out of the fire when it comes to democracy from the very beginning. And, this most recent presidential election, we've done the same. I mean, in several states, Black folks, the Black vote, Black turnout has made the difference amid a coronavirus, nonetheless, at which we are 3 times more likely to contract the virus than white people. So let me get right to this here. So why did Black folks serve in the military to begin with? And this is a question that I asked myself, when I was in the Navy. As I say in the preface to my first book, Fighting for Democracy, I was 21 years old, and I was running the Combat Information Center of a warship, and it just blew me away. And I was I was 2 Black people in the whole department, and I'm one of the most senior people, and it made me reflect on my grandfather, who was a steward's mate during World War II on a Navy ship. And for those of you that don't know what stewards mates are, basically what they were to say they were valets to the officers would be an overstatement. They cleaned the officers' room, they bought them their food, they cooked for them. And so here I am, these many years later, what are we talking, 45 years later, and I'm in this position of leadership, albeit at an enlisted rank. I was an E5, but position of leadership nonetheless. And so that served as a motivation for me to write my PhD dissertation years later, and this book, Fighting for Democracy. Like, what motivated Black folks to serve, given the fact that we have been treated as second-class citizens? Well, the whole idea behind that, it really takes root in what's called the citizen soldier paradigm. by which anybody who serves in the military, this goes all the way back to ancient Greece, should have a voice in its council to go to war in the first place. And so Black leadership had been aware of this. So that's why you get people like Frederick Douglass, who on the eve of the Civil War rallied for Black troops to serve, for Black folks to serve in the Civil War, and also W.B. Du Bois on the eve of World War I. So, so there begins this relationship between war and citizenship. And so for many years, at the very beginning, one of the reasons why we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution is because of Black military service during the Civil War. So you had the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves, right? You had the 14th Amendment, which was about due process and granting citizenship to anybody born in the United States, birthright citizenship, among other things. And then you had the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote, regardless of prior station in the United States with regard to servitude. So you had these really important constitutional amendments that passed in the wake of the Civil War. And a lot of that had to do with Black men serving in the military. Now, Black men weren't allowed to serve in the Continental military, right? Not the Continental military, the Union forces, right? No. They made up a whole new branch of the armed forces called the United States Colored Troops, right? So for all of you guys that thought that, what was happening during the Civil War with Black men serving with the Union Army, that is not how that went down, right? Black folks had to serve in the United States Colored Troops. So let's just get that one out of the way. Nevertheless, what happened was the officers, some of the officers, many of whom went on to serve in Congress, witnessed their service during the Civil War, and they gave testimony during Reconstruction in order to make way for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So that was a way in which military service and race work and citizenship work from the top down. Now, during World War I, it didn't happen like that. As a matter of fact, Black troops, half of the Black troop strength were lent to the French command because they weren't deemed as competent enough or sufficiently competent to serve alongside white troops. Now, the Black troops went on to win, many of whom went on to win the Croix de la Guerre, which is the third highest French commendation for military valor. The other half of the Black troops, right, that served under American forces, they were basically used as cannon fodder. And they were blamed for not having enough courage to fight during the First World War. And so not much progress happened after the First World War. And then along comes World War II. And then we didn't have top-down change after World War II, right? Because there was nothing really that happened beyond, as Colonel Gunn said, you had President Roosevelt who passed the executive order, as President Truman passed Executive Order 9981 that desegregated the armed forces. And it was only out of military necessity that it became desegregated during the Korean War, because Black troops were needed. And as Colonel Gunn said, it's only during times of war, at least for most of American history, that Black folks were really and truly welcome, right? And this was only during times of war, after which, our service, it was rarely acknowledged, if at all. So you had these veterans from World War II and the Korean War who spearheaded the civil rights movement in the South. And I argue in my book that's on the screen right now that if you didn't have these Black veterans like Amzie Moore and the Bloody Sunday March was led by another Black veteran. His name is escaping me right now. Hosea Williams, I believe his name was. If you didn't have Black veterans like that, that led the civil rights movement in the South, that were on the front lines, then I don't think the civil rights movement would have been a success that it was. So let me just wrap this real quick. So Black veterans are essential to where we are when it comes to American democracy. And the reason why Black men and women later on during World War II served in the armed forces was because it was a way to bring honor and citizenship and more equality to the Black community writ large. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Professor Parker. Our next speaker is Ms. Barbara Ward. She's a Vietnam era veteran who served as a commissioned officer in the Air Force Nurse Corps from 1972 to 1974. Her professional career spans over 40 years working in the healthcare and health insurance industries, as well as in state and federal government and the military. During the Obama administration, we served together when she was serving as the director of the Center for Minority Veterans at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. While in that role, she developed successful programs that specifically targeted over 5 million minority veterans nationwide to increase utilization of VA benefits. Before she began serving at VA, Ms. Ward served as a deputy secretary for women and minority veterans for the state of California. She worked with numerous veteran service organizations and stakeholders to service the needs of women and veterans. Of women veterans. She's the CEO and owner of Ward and Associates LLC, a consulting group focused on executive leadership and government operations. Ms. Ward obtained her Bachelor of Science degree in nursing from Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida, and her master's degree in public administration, health services management from Golden Gate University in San Francisco. Ms. Ward, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for that very warm introduction. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to serve on this most distinguished panel today as we share with each of you some knowledge and experience of ours related to race, the military, and veterans in general. My focus will be sharing information with you regarding minority veterans. Currently, minority veterans make up approximately 23% of the total veteran population. By 2045, it is anticipated that the number will increase to 36.2%. Think in terms of making up, being 23% of the total veteran population, but making up 43% of the actual homeless veteran population. That is just one of the major challenges that minority veterans face today. As Will talked about some of the discriminatory practices when we are actually on active duty, I hope that all of you understand that it just does not end when you leave active duty and then you become a veteran. Now, all veterans face pretty much the same challenges, whether you're talking about the need for a job when you transition to civilian life, access to quality health care, access to your benefits for compensation, and also thinking in terms of certain health conditions. Most of us are aware that the veterans and the military in general is a microcosm of society in general. So I think when you hear and you stay in touch with what's going on with COVID right now, you can really appreciate how that particular virus is impacting minorities in general. So we see the same thing when it comes down to health equity in the VA healthcare system. Minority veterans oftentimes do not receive the quality of care services that non-minority veterans receive. Delphine earlier in her brief comments referenced mental health services and some of the challenges that minority veterans face. If you can just imagine that you are a military veteran, you have post-traumatic stress disorders because of your service in combat, and then you seek medical attention so that you can file a claim for benefits for disability, and you are referred to a VA physician. When you encounter that physician, the physician number one doesn't look like you. and you immediately understand that this physician has some biases. And based on the discussion as it goes, you identify the stereotypes that they are relating to you. So instead of you're trying to convey to that particular physician at that time during your visit that you experienced blood, that you lost a buddy on the combat field, that physician actually says, I'm not really interested in talking with you about that. Let's go back and talk to you about your childhood. You know, did you experience violence? You know, did you come from a low income community? Was there violence in the home? Were you abused in some way? That's not typically the type visit that a non-minority veteran would experience. So you can immediately understand why, as a minority veteran and specifically an African-American veteran, you would prefer to seek out treatment from an African-American veteran or a minority veteran who understands you and your culture and is not actually going to deny you access to benefits that you've earned simply because of your race. When we think in terms of health equity, you run into the same thing as far as the services that are provided and the referral of those services. Chronic health conditions are prevalent in minority communities, and certainly they impact our minority veterans. And so when you seek healthcare assistance, you want to make sure that you're getting the best quality services possible. Unemployment is another major issue that all of our veterans experience. But all of these challenges that I'm sharing with you today, ultimately, what's different when you apply those same challenges to minority veterans is the ultimate impact from that standpoint. I've already talked about homelessness and what the high incidences of minority veterans being homeless. It's pretty much the same thing when you think in terms of unemployment. The current unemployment for minority veterans is 7.8%. For non-minority veterans, it's 6.1%. And that leads me to another topic that's relevant to minority veterans and employment within the federal government, and specifically if you think in terms of the VA system. Most federal agencies tend to hire veterans, and there are special points that you receive and considerations for your disability as well. Recently, the union at the Department of Veterans Affairs conducted a survey of all of their membership and found that there was a very high number of employees that said that they had experienced discrimination in the workplace. And many of those employees are not just regular employees, they are also veterans. So then you ask yourself, well, how does that impact our minority veterans? Well, it impacts minority veterans from the standpoint that oftentimes you can have all the qualifications that you need to apply for a position, and you will never be called for an interview in a federal agency. Or if you're called for an interview, you may make it to the top 3 candidates, and you're just not selected because of unconscious bias. So these are the same issues that we see that continue, that plague our military veterans. So those are the things that I wanted to share with you, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So Will, I'm going to defer back to you at this time.
Thanks very much, Barbara. I greatly appreciate it. I want to start off with a question for you, Delphine. And I first of all want to thank you and DAV for hosting this event. And I also just want to tell you that I've been able to refer a large number of veterans over the last several years to DAV and to other veteran services organizations. Mm-hmm. I have been amazed by the fact that so many veterans that I've come in contact with had no idea that they could get free help from organizations such as DAV to file their disability compensation claims. And could you just take a moment to talk about the type of advocacy that DAV does and the type of help that your organization gives to veterans?
Sure.
All veterans.
All veterans. Yeah, the DAV provides a lifetime of support for veterans of all generations and families in a positive, life-changing ways. They ensure veterans and their family have access to a full range of benefits they deserve. They provide care, employment information, support them during tough times, just like we just had it out here in California, all the fires. They supported that as much as any other disaster they have had around the world. You know, their advocacy for veterans community on Capitol Hill. They connect with meaningful employment and so much more. They're very approachable. Like you say, they are there to support you free of charge, free of charge. There have never been any, if, as I stated before, let me just back up. As I stated before, I look at my company and I still am in touch with a lot of my members. The first person I tell them to go to is DAV. They have heard DAV and the transitional service officer 30 plus years ago when we came back, but a lot of them forget. A lot of them were in such dice moments of PTSD, being a grave registration company. They don't even think of anything else. But now 30 years later, they come back and say, Top, can you refer me to someone? DAV is my first list. I have people I can call to help these people. They do not feel like, oh, well, my time is up or anything. So yeah, and as I say, I selected DAV because not only I read what they did, but I saw what they did.
Thanks very much. Greatly appreciate that. I wanted to turn to you, Professor Parker. The way that you describe the U.S. colored troops is a way that I'd never heard it before. You essentially were presenting that the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War were basically another military service. Would you agree with that characterization?
I most certainly would. They were an adjunct to the Union Army. Yes.
And just looking at your book, it seems in your remarks, you talk about Du Bois and other Black leaders that were encouraging participation in the military as a way of gaining rights. Do you believe that the military has, and the U.S. government for that matter, has fulfilled that implied promise?
Wow. You talking about even to this day, or are we referring specifically to the veterans that I discuss in my book?
Even to this day, you can take it as you like.
No. I mean, I think while we have rights, if you will, we have rights in principle, but are they really rights in practice? No, right? To the extent that discrimination still takes place on a daily basis, and ever since this, I refuse to call him my president. As soon as 45's been in office, I mean, the level of vitriol and of hostility that's been directed at people of color, especially Black folks, I mean, that threatens our physical integrity, and it affects our mental health. So no, while technically we do have rights on paper, yes. Is it much more difficult for us to practice those rights? Hell yeah. So I'll just, yeah. And once again, discrimination runs rampant, right? I mean, there are all kinds of studies that show that if one has a Black name, right, quote unquote Black name, it's more difficult for them to get a job. It's easier for a white man with a criminal record to get a job than a Black man, with a high school diploma with no felonies, right? So this discrimination, and that we talk housing discrimination, discrimination in the financial industry, all this stuff continues to happen. Residential segregation and the impact that it has on our ability to build wealth, this stuff remains in effect.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Professor. Ms. Ward, the Department of Veterans Affairs, you touched on this, that the VA will be investigated for widespread racism and discriminatory allegations made by employees. Do you feel that such allegations have impacted the hiring and career advancement of minority vets?
Well, that's an excellent question. Based on the 6 years that I worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs, I served on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, where we monitored very closely the hiring practices, recruitment, and actually retention rates. And frequently, we would talk about the number of minority veterans that had applied for jobs, but we didn't see them getting hired, especially in your higher senior level ranks at the Department of Veterans Affairs. So we would ask the question, is the issue that there are no qualified applicants being considered? And the answer always was no. Definitely there were qualified applicants, but the hiring authority, who typically is not a person of color, due to unconscious bias, selected someone that they were more comfortable with, someone that looked like them. So it had nothing to do with qualifications. So definitely. The other thing that we followed very closely was the retention rates for the number of veterans that were actually hired and how many of those were terminated during their probation period. And one of the things that we found that was a consistent pattern was the highest number of veterans that were actually terminated in their probation period, the first 3 months of having worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs, were African-American male veterans. So definitely discrimination does impact that.
Now I don't know. Can you repeat that last statistic again about the probationary period?
Well, during the probationary period, as most of us are aware, you have to pass your probationary period, but it's an opportunity for the hiring authority to determine whether or not you can do the job. And what we found when we looked at retention rates, especially for minority veterans, the group that had the highest termination rate during their probation period were African-American male veterans.
Thank you. I have a question. I have a question from the audience, and here's one, basically paraphrasing. Extreme racism is not recognized by VA as trauma for a PTSD claim under VA service-connected disability compensation. Do the panelists think stress or trauma caused by racial discrimination can or should be treated similarly to combat or military sexual trauma to support a PTSD disability claim? I present that to any of you who would like to respond.
Okay, I will start that answer on this particular question. I know that it's not well recognized that discrimination that you experience on active duty can actually be used for you to file for benefits for post-traumatic stress disorders. But I actually know that there are some veterans that have received claims for benefits just for that purpose. I have a very close friend who is a retired colonel nurse from Southern California, and she was a Vietnam veteran as well. And she actually ended up getting her claim approved. I think a lot of it has to do with, as Delphine talked about, if you go to a reputable veteran service organization, oftentimes they can help you based on all the information that you give them to put your claim together in such a way that you can actually be successful in having your claim accepted. But I certainly do believe, based on many of the stories that I have heard, specifically from minority veterans and a lot of minority women veterans specifically, that yes, that discrimination experience on active duty, I feel should be allowed if you have justification and necessary documentation to support your allegations.
Thank you, Barbara.
Mhm.
Delphine or Chris?
Yeah, I think it should be allowed also. Case in point, something that happened to me why I was allowed that and other PTSD rating. I'll never forget one of my providers mentioned to me about my duty in the military when I went overseas. And when I mentioned to him that I was in grade registration, he looked at me, he said, "What did you do?" I said, "What did I do? I mean, did you do anything wrong?" And I'll never forget this. And I said, "Well, did I do something wrong? What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, grade registration is a company, you go back in World War One, World War Two, that they put people in, if something they want to get rid of them or they don't fit their mold or something." I says, "Excuse me?" Which I did my own research. And I said, he said, "No, no, no. You definitely, oh no, anyone in your company, but you, especially with being in charge of something like that." And right there told me there was a difference. I did some research. I saw some minorities that were in charge of that company back in the day. I said, wow. Mhm. So I agree.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Chris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with my fellow panelists in that, for one, if you're all supposed to be in there in the military pulling towards the same collective goal. And the fact that one is subject to discrimination based on their race, and you're willing to put your life on the line just like anybody else. I mean, that's just a whole nother level of BS that we shouldn't have to deal with. And we have to deal with it. I mean, we've all dealt with it, I think, in the military. And it always kind of struck me as odd, since I'm thinking we're all supposed to be, trying to complete the same mission. But you guys are treating me like this based strictly and solely on the color of my skin, right? This should not be happening here. And so that's just a whole additional layer of stress with which we should not have to deal.
Thank you. Another question from our audience: what needs to be done to disrupt the trends that you all have identified? How do we make significant progress and institutionalize fairness and equal treatment?
Well, you know what I do? I get involved in my community and the VA on advisory boards. I get involved with my congressman. I'm on his military advisory committee, and have my voice heard. Okay. I don't just say, well, it's the VA's fault, but I know there's some issues there. But I put myself out there to get involved in other things so I can have, as you say, documentation to bring forth and to share.
Thank you.
That's what I do. I get involved, and especially involved with my advocacy with women veterans and our DAV mission. Um, you know, in order to have change, we have to also be part of that change. And I think by joining certain committees, certain organizations, we can bring the forth, and we can make change. We can make change.
Great.
That's my feeling.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Barbara or Chris, any thoughts?
Well, I actually agree with Delphine's comments. And I think what I would say to everyone, how you bring about change is that you have to be a part of the change process that you want to see. And I think we need to be more vocal as veterans, and we need to make sure that we have a seat at the table. We now have a new administration coming on board. This is certainly the time for us to voice what our concerns are, just as we recently discovered that they've already identified members of the transition team for the Department of Veterans Affairs. That would be a great opportunity to network and find those individuals so that you can say, these are the things that are problematic. These are the things that need to change, and not just say these things need to change, but also to say, these are my recommendations. I agree with Delphine from the standpoint of serving on Veterans Affairs advisory committees. I've served on the Women Veterans Advisory Committee. We had a Minority Veterans Advisory Committee. And currently I serve on the Research Advisory Committee for Gulf War veteran illnesses. And so I think you have to be a part of these committees and advocacy groups, and you have to know who your congressional representatives are to call out the deficiencies that you see that are impacting veterans in general.
Thank you. Chris, any thoughts?
I'll just simply say me three. I mean, I mean, my co-panelists are on fire. I have to agree with everything they said. I have nothing important to add.
Great, appreciate you. But Barbara, I believe if I heard you correctly, you said that about 23% of veterans are minorities, but that
Yes.
43% of all homeless veterans are minorities. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What do you think accounts for that disparity?
Well, I think you have to go back to the Vietnam War because many of the veterans, like in Los Angeles has one of the highest homeless veteran rates there is in any state or city in the country. And part of that is due to the Vietnam veterans, because if you remember when the war was fought and we came back home, there were no welcoming committees for us. There was no one standing up for any of us. And so you had a large percentage of minority veterans that had post-traumatic stress disorder that never received appropriate treatment. So they have become chronically homeless veterans. I also think discrimination plays a role in this from the standpoint that oftentimes when you have veterans that did not make a lot of money when they were on active duty, and many of those are minority active duty members, when they transition to civilian life, if you're being discriminated against and you cannot get gainful employment, then you're going to end up homeless. I also think that once you are referred to, let's say, HUD, and you get a voucher, frequently you are dealing with landlords that they don't really see a Black veteran, they just see a Black person. And they can choose to either rent to you and accept your voucher or not. And many times they choose not to, just on the mere fact that you are a minority. So I think also oftentimes minority veterans are not aware of all of the services that the VA offers, as far as having a homeless veteran coordinator at every VA medical center that's there to help you facilitate to find housing. So I think it's a combination of all of those things.
Thank you. Chris or Delphine, do either of you have anything to add on that point?
No, I agree, definitely what Barbara said. I definitely agree. But I want to also interject something about, information and history about our military and minority veterans. I didn't get my degree until I was 59 years old. And Sonoma State University I went to, they found out I was a veteran and what have you. And the first thing my counselor asked me, oh my gosh. And she looked at what I, combat vet, the whole bit. I was going on my chapter 31 from the VA. And she said, can I put you in contact with our history department? And I says, history department? Oh, sure. And so, make a long story short, two professors at that university had asked me to talk to their class about women in the military. I was just really floored. I said, women in the military? They said, we don't have that in history books.
Yes.
I said, wow. And they said, ma'am, would you mind, coming to our class? And so I made that a point of doing that while I was at that university each year. And I thought it was just awesome. I said, you would think living in this time that women veterans would be brought up in history books. Minority veterans will be brought up in history books, but they're not. But they're not. And so I think it starts at another level also. And that's when they are growing up, young people, to make them aware of just what we have done as a race and also as a veteran.
Let me ask this. What specific advice would you all offer to a veteran today on how to handle discrimination when seeking or getting services?
Well, the advice that I would offer is to first off, utilize the veteran service organizations if you're actually trying to file a claim for benefits. But if you're talking about specifically for discrimination, I think start out with, if you're minority veterans, with the Center for Minority Veterans to see what guidance that they can give you. And I think to utilize whatever resources that are available, let's say within the VA system, and just don't accept that you're being discriminated against and get frustrated and not pursue the benefits that you've actually earned. Because that's one of the big differences that I find with minority veterans. They might go to a county vet service officer, and if they feel that this person is biased against them, then they will just go become frustrated and sit home and complain about it, but they don't do anything to be proactive. Where with non-minority veterans, I've found that if they feel that someone's not treating them fairly, they will go to 10 different people. If it takes 10 people for them, they keep knocking on doors and placing phone calls and voicing their concern until someone hears them. So I think you just have to make sure that you know what resources are available, how to utilize them, and see the process through to the end. Those would be my thoughts.
Thank you. Let me ask this. With considering the discussion that we've had here today, with the racial disparity that continues in the military for service members and veterans, what would you say to say someone 18 to 22 who's looking at the military as an option? Is it a good option? What do you think? Delphine?
Yes, I would. And I'm going to mention something else about a Veterans Military Academy Committee I was on. But I tell young people also to check those academies out. Check those academies out. And also remember there is a prep school.
Mhm.
You know, I've heard so many people talk about the academies, and a lot of young people are not ready in a lot of ways. And I would start with that. Have them start checking out if they want to go in the military academy, and there's other ways to get in, but make sure you know the history of what you're doing. You know, make sure you know everything. And in order to know that, like I said, even and I say the academy because being on that academy, I saw so many young people come up um, with good grades and excellent grades and never did anything else but the grades, but did not know how to function when it came to the committee, know how to speak with him and what have you. Um, and it was just kind of sad. So I would advise, you know, young people to do some research. Research. Mhm.
Great. Thank
Yeah.
you. Professor, what do you think about that? Is military a good option? What would you say to a young person who's considering it?
Well, I think I saw a message from him saying that he had to leave,
All
so
right,
I
go
will
ahead.
answer.
All right, please
Um,
do.
I would say, based on my experience, I would definitely tell young people, I think the military offers vast opportunities in spite of discrimination or other things that we hear about all the time. I would suggest that they find someone who has been in the military, who has experienced that lifestyle, and to try and connect with them, to have them as a mentor, possibly to offer them guidance. Using myself as an example, I actually had finished nursing school when I decided to go into the Air Force. And at that time, I only had to make a 2-year commitment, active duty. And I determined at that time, this is just not for me. So I need to go ahead and get my honorable discharge. But in exchange for just 2 years of service, my nursing experience taught me impeccable organizational skills that have followed me throughout my 47-year career. I was able to buy my first home when I got a divorce using my VA loan. And when I went through my first layoff, I was able to use my GI Bill to get my master's degree, which has helped me throughout my career as well. So I think anything that you venture in life, there's always pros and cons, but I think that the military offers so many benefits and opportunities for our young people that probably wouldn't have those opportunities if they did not go in the military. So I would definitely encourage them to do that, but to find someone that can mentor them and to guide them in that process.
I think we have time for maybe at least one more question. How can we best talk to our white fellow veterans and help them understand what Black veterans experience in the military? Are there ways that you can recommend that white veterans can be good allies to Black veterans?
A better dialogue,
Mm.
and even in organizations, a better dialogue with Black veterans.
Does the DAV offer such a forum for dialogue?
They don't offer a forum that I know of, although we have committees that we do get together and talk as a group. But on a one-to-one, veteran, I think you should have more dialogue with our minority veterans, inviting them in on committees, inviting them in on certain programs, and seeing their opinion about things. I think a dialogue is really needed.
Okay. Barbara, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think communication definitely is key, and I hate to present a negative perspective, but I'm just going to be honest. I spent 6 years working as the director for the Center for Minority Veterans at the VA, and I was just amazed that whenever we would follow through on complaints, how fellow white veterans just didn't get it. And no matter how you tried to explain it to them, it's like you could talk and talk about the reason why you need data, so that you can either dispel allegations that are being lodged or disprove them. And, from their perspective, well, there really are no issues within the VA. There is no discrimination. You tell them something happened at a VA and VA facility, and then the response will be, well, that's just anecdotal because there's no data to substantiate that. But if it was one non-minority veteran that had that same problem, it's amazing how many people would get involved and do everything that they can. So I think just as in society, we definitely have to keep the communications going. But I really think the big issue with the Department of Veterans Affairs is that there need to be substantial policy changes implemented.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's been a question about whether or not this will be posted, and my understanding from talking to Dan that it will be. I have just one thought to share since we're approaching the last minute of our conversation here today, and that is, in looking at the disparities, I think a lot of it, a significant amount, comes from lack of knowledge or lack of perspective. Here's what I mean. During my military career, almost 2 decades ago, I got a chance to travel with the Judge Advocate General. And we'd go to different installations and we'd receive briefings where data, such as the data that I shared earlier, showing how Black Air Force members were being punished through non-judicial punishment at much higher rates than others. And my boss, the Judge Advocate General, would ask about that. And the typical response was, sir, we've pulled each one of those cases and we can assure you that evidence supports each and every one of those charges. And my boss, who is Caucasian, his typical response was along these lines. I'm glad to hear that, and I'm not surprised at all to hear that. But the reality is, the thing that data doesn't tell us is who got a break, who wasn't punished, who perhaps received a stern talking to as opposed to being written up or having a matter referred to non-judicial punishment. or ultimately to a court-martial and the discharge. We have issues with respect to unconscious bias. And as I heard former President Obama talk about just last night, we're in the midst of a journey. And that journey is to make America a more perfect union. And that includes the military. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today for this important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine. Thank you, Barbara. And
You're welcome.
I'll pass along my thanks as well to Professor Parker and to Chris. Thank you. Dan?
Thank you, everyone. Take care. And thank you to our incredible moderator and panel. Be well, everyone.
Thank you. You also.
Thank you.
Thank you.